The first thing I remember is the taste of salt, thick and metallic, clinging to the back of my throat as if the ocean itself had crawled inside me. Darkness pressed against my eyes, yet it was not the absence of light. It was the weight of something ancient, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the depths beneath my feet, I could feel it breathing. If you stay with me, you'll see what I saw, feel what I felt, and know why I wish I had turned back before it was too late. This is not a story you can skim and forget. It will cling to you, follow you into the quiet hours, and wait beside your bed when you wake at night. Keep listening, and I will take you where the maps end, into the waters that no sailor returns from unchanged. The expedition began like any other, a promise of discovery, a generous funding grant, and the intoxicating lure of rewriting history. I boarded the research vessel Calyptra with a folder of ancient cartography and a digital sonar map that supposedly pinpointed the impossible. We were to spend 32 days at sea, charting an anomaly far beneath the waves. Yet from the moment the engines roared to life, I felt the first tremor of unease, a faint pulse in my bones, as if something deep below had become aware of me. The ocean was calm at first, glassy under the weight of a cloudless sky. It should have been reassuring, yet there was something unnatural about that stillness, as if the waves themselves were holding their breath. I kept my eyes on the horizon, pretending to be fascinated by the way the sunlight fractured into silver shards across the water. In truth, I was trying to ignore the faint, rhythmic vibration under the deck. Too deep, too slow to be the engine. We passed the third day without incident, except for the night terrors. I had not suffered from them in years, yet now, each time I closed my eyes, I found myself walking through colossal stone corridors. The walls were wet, breathing with the faint hiss of unseen tides. My hands trailed over carvings I could not fully see. Figures bent in worship before shapes that hurt my mind to picture. By the sixth day, sleep no longer felt like rest, felt like descent. The sonar image came through at noon, an enormous structure half buried in silt, its geometry sharp enough to defy the chaos of the seabed. It rose like the spine of some submerged leviathan, each ridge too precise to be natural. We circled the coordinates twice, dropping marker buoys into the swell. The others spoke in low voices, exhilarated at the thought of discovery. I said nothing. In my mind, the stone corridors returned, but this time I was not walking alone. Something followed just beyond the edge of vision, keeping pace. That night, as the moon swelled over black water, I dreamed not of the corridors but of an open city. A city drowned in moonlight. Towers of pale stone twisted toward the surface, their roots tangled in darkness. I felt the wind of another age on my skin, smelled fires that had burned out thousands of years ago, and heard the voice of a city that did not want to be found. When I woke, my pillow was damp, not with sweat, but with grains of fine, pale sand clinging to the fabric. First, I thought I was still dreaming. The dim glow of my cabin light faded into a soft, amber haze, and the hum of the ship's generator gave way to the slow churn of waves against stone. I was standing barefoot on a causeway, the stones warm beneath my feet as if they had soaked in the sun all day. The air was rich with the scent of salt and something sweeter, like crushed blossoms. On either side of the causeway, water stretched out in calm, perfect symmetry, reflecting towers of pale marble and glass that shimmered with their own inner light. They rose impossibly high, their spires entwined with veins of gold and deep blue crystal, as though the city itself had grown from the ocean floor. I walked forward, not knowing why, yet feeling the deep pull of belonging. People moved around me, their faces serene yet strangely vacant, their steps guided by some rhythm I could not hear. Their garments rippled in the sea breeze, white fabrics threaded with silver, and I realized there was no sound of conversation, only the distant, steady beat of something vast beneath us. As I crossed into the heart of the city, the light dimmed, not as though the sun had set, but as if something in the air itself had drawn away. The towers seemed taller now, leaning over me, their glass surfaces rippling faintly, almost breathing. The people moved faster, their eyes fixed ahead, toward a structure at the city's center. a massive temple of black stone that swallowed the glow around it. And then I saw them, the carvings from my dreams, etched into the temple walls, spirals nested within spirals, shapes that seemed to twist when I was not looking directly at them, and figures kneeling before a shadowed throne. The shadow was wrong. It did not match the light. It seemed to spill outward, creeping toward me. I tried to step back, but the causeway was gone. The water pressed close now, black and heavy, and I felt something move beneath its surface. Slow, deliberate, aware. The beat grew louder, no longer beneath my feet, but inside my chest, shaking my bones. My vision swam. The amber haze tore like paper, and I woke in my cabin, gasping, the ship swaying under the weight of a sudden swell. On my bedside table, the pale sand was gone. In its place was a single wet seashell that pulsed once, faintly, in my hand. By morning, the seashell had dried to a brittle, pearlescent husk, yet I could not bring myself to discard it. Something in its spiral felt alive, as though it held the echo of a voice just beyond hearing. I turned it over in my palm again and again, tracing the ridges until my fingertips tingled. The crew noticed my distraction but said nothing. They were too focused on the dive preparations. Today we would descend for the first time. The captain's voice came over the intercom, brisk and clipped, outlining the schedule, the safety protocols, the reminder that our work would be documented for the Institute. His words drifted past me like smoke. I was staring at the sonar display, where the anomaly lay in jagged perfection, a fragment of geometry on the ocean floor, waiting for us. We launched the submersible at noon. The water closed over the viewport in a wash of green light, scattering bubbles like glass beads into the depths. I tried to focus on the instruments, but the deeper we went, the more I felt the weight pressing down. Not just the pressure of the ocean, but the awareness of being watched. At 600 meters, the sunlight thinned into darkness. At 900, the readings on the sonar began to spike, throwing phantom shapes across the screen. Then the structure appeared. It rose from the seabed like the crown of some vast, buried city. Rows of towering spires, each wrapped in strange coral-like growths. The forms were too symmetrical to be natural. Even through the viewport's distortion, I could see the glint of something metallic embedded in the stone. My skin prickled. These were the towers I had walked among in my dreams, the same proportions, the same impossible smoothness of the walls. The pilot steered us closer. That was when I heard it. Faint at first, like a vibration in my jaw, then swelling into something almost musical. A long, low note, resonating through the metal hull of the submersible, came in pulses, steady as a heartbeat. The crew could not hear it. They moved about their work, logging readings, murmuring observations into headsets. But I could feel the sound threading into my bones. The seashell in my pocket grew warm, almost painfully so. When we reached the largest spire, I saw the carvings, spirals upon spirals, identical to those etched into the black temple in my vision. I felt a shiver move through me, not from fear, but from recognition, as though I had been here before. The moment my gaze fixed on the carvings, the black water outside seemed to ripple, and for the briefest instant, I saw not coral, not stone, but pale hands pressing against the spire's surface from the inside. I blinked. The hands were gone. That night, the visions returned. I was back in Atlantis, standing before the Black Temple. The people around me were not serene anymore. Their vacant faces had twisted into masks of devotion and terror, their eyes reflecting the same spirals carved into the walls. The air was heavy with a chant, low and rhythmic, matching the pulse I had heard in the deep. At the temple's entrance, the shadowed throne was no longer empty. Something sat there, indistinct yet immense, its form shifting like ink in water. It raised its head, and though it had no eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. When I woke, my pillow was wet with seawater. The seashell lay beside me, and from within its spiral, I could swear I heard breathing. The morning after the dive, the ship felt different. The hallways seemed narrower, the air heavy and damp as though the ocean had seeped into the walls during the night. Every sound carried too far, the clank of a dropped wrench, the echo of boots on metal stairs, the soft, irregular rhythm of something dripping where there should have been no leak. I tried to focus on the data we had collected. Charts and sonar maps lay spread across the table, their lines sharp and definitive, but I could not concentrate on them. My attention kept drifting to the seashell. It had cracked during the night, a thin fracture splitting the spiral. Each time I turned my head, I swore I heard something faint inside it, like whispers pressed against glass. The crew avoided me now. At breakfast, I felt their glances cut toward me and then quickly away, as though I carried a sickness. Perhaps they sensed what I had brought back from the depths, though they had no words for it. The pilot muttered about interference in the instruments, the captain about strange currents pulling the ship off course. None of them admitted the truth that something had followed us from the sea. By midday, the first failure struck. The sonar system flickered with static, not random but patterned, the distortion forming spirals that looped endlessly on the screen. The technician swore and rebooted the system 3 times, but each time the spirals returned, sharper and more deliberate. Finally, he tore the power from the console, his face pale. The night that followed was worse. I had tried to resist sleep, but exhaustion overcame me, and the visions seized me with more clarity than ever. I was in Atlantis again, though now the city was not calm or luminous. The towers leaned like broken teeth against a sky torn with storm clouds. The people no longer walked in silence. They ran, their eyes wide, their hands clutching children and offerings alike, streaming toward the black temple at the city's heart. The chanting was louder now, no longer rhythmic but desperate, rising to a fever pitch. Inside the temple, the throne of shadow loomed larger, its occupant unfolding into something that scraped the edges of sight. It was vast and coiled, layered in shapes that should not exist, each one shifting as though alive. The people pressed their foreheads to the floor, trembling, weeping, offering themselves. And all the while, the tide rose higher, black water flooding the streets. As the first wave crashed against my ankles, I woke gasping. My cabin floor was wet, seawater pooling beneath the bed, lapping at my shoes. I leapt up, but when I opened the door to the hallway, the floor outside was dry. The water was gone. Only the smell of brine lingered, thick in my nostrils. I pressed the cracked seashell to my ear, and for the first time, the whisper inside it was clear. It was not speech, not words, but a rhythm, a command, a pulse that matched the beating of my own heart. That was when I understood. The visions were not dreams. They were memories, and they were no longer confined to the past. By the 4th week at sea, the change in the crew was no longer subtle. At first, it was only in their eyes, a glassy sheen, like moonlight on still water, that made their gazes hard to meet. Then their movements began to change, slow and deliberate, as if each step were guided by something unseen. Conversations dwindled, the clatter of tools, the hum of engines, even the idle music that once leaked from the mess hall had all faded into silence. The captain no longer looked at me directly. When he spoke, it was in short, mechanical bursts, his words precise but hollow. I caught him more than once standing at the ship's rail in the middle of the night, staring into the black water as though waiting for something to surface. The pilot had stopped eating. The technician traced spirals in grease across the instrument panels, his fingers moving without pause, as though compelled. I tried to ask what was wrong, but their responses were not really answers. Half-formed sentences that trailed into mutters, their voices low and wet, as if shaped underwater. Sometimes, when I stood in the corridor, I could hear them speaking in unison from different corners of the ship, murmuring in the same slow cadence that haunted my visions. The seashell had split further, its spiral unraveling into jagged fragments. Each shard still pulsed faintly, but when I touched them, my fingers burned as if they had been plunged into ice. I hid the pieces in a drawer, though I knew even then it was pointless. Whatever was inside them was already inside me. That night, I did not resist the pull of sleep. The moment my eyes closed, the city rose around me again, but it was no longer distant or alien. I walked its streets with certainty, my feet finding paths I had once known in another life. I knew the names of the towers, the weight of the air before a storm, the scent of the harbor when the tide came in. And I knew, without doubt, that I had been here before the drowning. The Black Temple loomed ahead, its gates thrown wide. I entered, feeling the same pressure that I had felt in the submersible, a gravity that bent thought and breath toward the throne. The figure upon it was clearer now, its form layered and coiled, its edges shivering like heat above asphalt. From it radiated a hunger so vast it hollowed me out just to stand before it. I knelt, unbidden. Around me, the Atlanteans did the same, their faces slack with devotion. They offered themselves freely, not in fear, but in longing. And in the way their eyes glowed faintly with spirals of light, I saw the same expression I now recognized in my crew. When I woke, the captain was standing at the foot of my bed, his eyes fixed on me in the dark. He said nothing, only turned and walked away. On my desk lay the largest shard of the shell, wet with fresh seawater. The next morning, I woke to find my cabin door locked from the outside. The metal was cold against my palm, damp as if condensation had seeped into the hinges. I banged on it once, twice, but the sound was swallowed by the ship's thick silence.
No footsteps approached.
When the door finally opened hours later, it was not the captain or any officer. It was the technician, his eyes rimmed in black shadows, his lips trembling with an unspoken chant. He did not acknowledge me. He simply left the door ajar and walked down the hallway without a word, his bare feet leaving faint wet prints on the steel floor. I stepped out and followed those prints. They led me past the mess hall, now dark and empty, and down toward the engine room. The smell hit first, not oil or diesel, but brine, deep and organic, like rotting seaweed baking under a relentless sun. Inside, the pilot and the captain stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at the humming machinery. The sound was wrong, less a mechanical thrum than a slow, deliberate pulse. As I edged closer, I saw that the dials and gauges had been overlaid with spirals scratched into the metal, their grooves filled with something glistening and black. The captain's head turned toward me, too slowly, his neck creaking like a stiff hinge. His voice was low, deliberate, each word falling like a stone into water. He told me I had no reason to fight, that the tide was coming, and we could only move with it or be dragged under. His words crawled into my mind, settling in the spaces between my thoughts. I backed away before they could close the distance. The corridors seemed longer now, the lighting dimmer, the shadows heavier than before. My breath caught in my throat, not from fear alone, but from the awareness that the air itself felt thinner, carrying the faint taste of salt water. That night, I stayed awake as long as I could, listening to the ship creak and groan. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and the visions claimed me again. I stood in Atlantis, but the city was half drowned now. Water surged through the streets, carrying debris, fragments of marble, and the bodies of those who had not reached the temple in time. Above, the sky churned with storm clouds the color of deep bruises. The temple gates yawned wide, and from within came the steady pulse, louder now, so loud I could feel it in my teeth. The shadowed figure rose from the throne, and its shape unfolded in ways that defied direction. Lengths and coils, a shifting mass of angles and curves that pulled the eye and mind apart. It stepped down toward the water, and the waves themselves bent around it, sinking lower in reverence. When it reached me, I realized there was no separation between its gaze and the sea. I was looking into an ocean without end, and it was looking back through me. I woke choking on seawater, my lungs burning. The floor of my cabin was dry. Outside my door, footsteps paced slowly back and forth. They did not stop until morning. By dawn, I knew the pacing outside my door had not been idle. The lock was gone. Torn clean from the frame, the metal edges bent inward like something had pressed them from the other side. I stepped into the hallway and felt the air shift around me, heavy and damp, each breath leaving a faint mist. The ship was no longer the ship. The narrow corridors curved in ways they never had before, their angles subtly wrong, as if the metal walls were bending to some hidden geometry. I ran my palm along the bulkhead and felt grooves under the paint. Spirals carved deep into the steel, warm to the touch. Voices murmured from the deck above, low and overlapping, moving in the same rhythmic cadence that had been haunting me in dreams. I climbed the stairs, each step slick beneath my boots, until I emerged onto the main deck. The crew stood in a semicircle at the bow, the captain at their center. All of them faced the sea, their heads tilted slightly upward, their hands held loosely at their sides as if in surrender. The water ahead was wrong, still as glass, yet impossibly dark, a void where light refused to linger. Something beneath its surface shifted, sending ripples that did not break against the hull but curved away, as though the ship were being repelled or measured. The captain spoke, his voice carrying with unnatural clarity across the deck. He said that the city had heard us, that we were marked now, and that the sea would not return us until we answered its call. His words were not for me alone. They were for whatever listened below. When I tried to step back toward the stairs, two of the crew broke from the line and moved to block me. Their faces were slack, but their eyes were alive, spirals of faint light turning slowly within the pupils. Their movements were not hurried, but inevitable, as though they knew I could not escape. The pulse came then, deep and resonant, vibrating through the deck and into my bones. My vision swam, and for a moment, the ocean ahead was gone. In its place rose the flooded streets of Atlantis, the black temple towering at the horizon. I stood on the causeway again, the tide rushing in from both sides, and the shadowed figure emerging from the water to claim what was left of the city. When the vision broke, I was on my knees, the captain's hand gripping my shoulder like a vice. He told me the sea was patient, but I was not, and that soon the difference would no longer matter. That night, I tried to barricade my door, but the metal felt softer than it should, as if the walls themselves were breathing. From somewhere deep in the hull, the pulse came again. Steady, patient, and closer than before. The pulse woke me before dawn, but it was no longer a sound. It was movement. The walls trembled in time with it, a slow, dragging rhythm, as though the ship were being hauled forward by something deep below. My breath plumed in the cold air, carrying with it the faint tang of salt. The barricade I would made the night before was gone. The chair, the overturned desk, vanished, though I had heard no sound of them being moved. My door stood wide open, and from the hallway came the sound of bare feet padding slowly toward me. They were waiting when I stepped out, for of them, two on either side, faces blank, eyes glimmering with spirals that turned in perfect unison. Their clothes were soaked, water dripping from their hair onto the steel floor, though we had not had rain in days. None of them spoke. They simply closed the gap between us and reached for my arms. Their touch was ice. I struggled, but their grip was unyielding, more like rope than flesh. They dragged me down the corridor toward the main deck, their pace unbroken despite my kicking. My boots scraped across the spirals now etched into the floor itself, the grooves deeper than any human hand could have cut in metal. The pattern curved ahead of us, leading toward the bow like a map I did not want to follow. When the deck doors swung open, the cold hit me like a wall. The sea ahead lay unnaturally still again, its surface a perfect mirror to the black sky. At the very center of that darkness, something swirled beneath, a vortex without wind or waves, just a slow, endless turning. The captain waited at the railing, his eyes locked on the water. He told me the tide had chosen, and that resistance was not defiance, only delay. His voice was too calm, his words too measured. Behind him, the crew began to hum, their tones rising and falling in the same inhuman rhythm that had haunted my dreams. They lifted me, their hands sliding beneath my arms, and stepped closer to the edge. The ocean tilted in my vision, the black surface swallowing the horizon. The pulse in my chest matched the vortex below. And then another vision struck, but it did not wait for sleep this time. I was beneath the surface, the water cold and heavy around me, the city of Atlantis towering above the seabed. It was not ruin. It was alive, the spires gleaming, the streets thrumming with movement. The black temple rose highest, and from its gates poured a tide of figures, their eyes filled with the same spirals as my captors. They were coming toward me. The crew's grip faltered for just a heartbeat, enough for me to twist free and stumble back onto the deck. The hum broke into shouts, their voices still too low, too liquid to be entirely human. I ran, though the ship's corridors were wrong again. Longer, darker, their curves bending me back toward the deck no matter which way I turned. The air seemed to thicken around me, and the pulse followed, growing faster. Somewhere deep in the hull, water was rushing in. The first rush of water came from below, a muffled roar that trembled through the floor plates like a giant exhaling. I thought at first it was just a breach, steel giving way to the weight of the ocean, but then the sound shifted. It was not random. It was rhythmic. The corridors were colder now, the air carrying mist that curled and lingered like breath from something unseen. My boots splashed through shallow pools that had not been there moments before, the water rising faster than gravity should allow. It did not run or spill the way water should. It crept, curling around corners, tracing spirals along the walls before pooling at my feet. I forced my way toward the lower deck to find the source, but the stairs ended halfway down, their metal steps folding and twisting into shapes that were neither ladder nor railing, archways, ribbed and curved, like the inside of some vast shell. I realized, with a slow chill crawling up my spine, that the grooves in the walls were no longer carved. They were grown. Somewhere deeper, I heard the captain's voice, but it was different now, warmer, richer, layered with a second tone that resonated in my ribs. He was speaking to someone or something that I could not see. The crew answered in unison, their voices a tidal hum that made the water at my boots tremble. I tried to turn back, but the corridor ahead of me had shifted. The bulkheads bowed inward, their metal skin slick and translucent in patches, and beyond them, shadows moved as though watching. The air grew heavier, each breath thick with salt. My lungs burned. When I looked down, the water had reached my knees. But it was not just water. It was warm, faintly luminous, and within its glow I saw shapes coiling, darting, retreating when my gaze fixed on them. They did not feel like fish. They felt like thoughts. I stumbled forward, searching for any path upward, but every turn brought me back to the same junction, the same dripping archways, the same faint reflection of my own face in the water, until the reflection smiled, though I had not. Then came the pulse, deep and sudden, reverberating through the ship so hard I fell to my hands. The water around me rippled outward, and in those ripples, for just an instant, the reflection changed. It was no longer my face. It was the figure from the throne, gazing up at me from below the surface, its outline shifting, coiling, beckoning. Somewhere above, the emergency klaxon began to wail, but even that sound bent into the rhythm of the pulse. When I forced myself up the stairs, the water followed, slow at first, then faster, as though pulled by invisible hands. And in its rise, I understood. It was not flooding the ship. It was replacing it. By the time I reached the upper deck, the water was already there, sloshing in shallow waves across the planks, licking at my boots as though tasting me before the deeper pull. The crew stood in their semicircle again, motionless except for the slow sway of their bodies with the ship's unnatural rhythm. Their eyes caught the dim light, spirals glowing faintly within. The captain stepped forward, his boots barely disturbing the water. He raised one hand, not to me, but to the ocean behind him. The surface answered. It broke without a splash, the black water swelling upward in a slow column that bent and coiled. It formed over the deck, the shadows within its depths moving with deliberate precision. The pulse came again, but it was not sound anymore. It was touch, brushing against my thoughts like fingers across a locked door. The crew turned toward me in perfect unison. They did not grab me this time. They did not have to. The water surged forward, curling around my legs with the strength of chains. It climbed my body faster than I could react, warm and heavy, carrying the faint scent of blossoms from my earliest visions. I was pulled under before I could breathe. The cold should have shocked me, but it did not. The water slid into my lungs without pain, replacing air with something heavier yet sustaining. I opened my eyes, and the blackness cleared into a dim, shimmering light. Atlantis rose around me. Not the ruins, not the broken stone I had glimpsed from the submersible, but the living city. Towers of pale stone and crystal spiraled upward, their tips vanishing into the water's haze. Bridges arched between them, draped with flowing banners that shimmered in the shifting currents. People moved through the streets, their steps slow but certain, their faces calm in the same unnatural way as my crew's. The water here did not behave like the ocean. It hung in perfect clarity, thick enough to move slowly through, yet carrying no sense of pressure. My limbs felt lighter, my senses sharper. I could hear the city, not with my ears, but through the bones of my skull, the constant hum of its heartbeat, the steady pull toward its center. The Black Temple was waiting for me, just as it always had. Its gates yawned wide, and inside, the throne of shadow waited, the figure upon it watching with patient hunger. It was clearer now, almost human in outline, but its surface was in constant motion, shapes folding into shapes, as though it was made from the same substance as the sea itself. I stepped forward without resistance. My feet touched the temple's floor, and for the first time the figure spoke. Not in words, but in a sound that bypassed thought entirely, filling me with knowledge I did not want but could not refuse. I understood now why Atlantis had fallen. I understood what the tide wanted, and I understood why it had chosen me. Behind me, the gates began to close. I do not know if the sun rises or sets here. The water holds the same dim, amber light at all times, as though the city exists inside the pause between two heartbeats. The people move around me without question, without recognition, their faces placid yet drained of individuality. They glide through the streets on errands I cannot name, carrying vessels carved from the same pale stone as the towers. When they pass me, their eyes slide across mine, spirals turning faintly within, the same as my crew's. I walk. I do not remember deciding to, but my feet find the paths instinctively. The city feels familiar, painfully so, as if I had lived here for years before it drowned. I know which bridges to cross to reach the upper tiers, which arches lead to market squares, and which narrow alleys lead downward, always downward, toward the temple. The temple is the anchor. Even when I turn away, my steps bend back toward it. Its black stone swallows the light, reflecting nothing. The gates remain open now, though I never see anyone enter or leave. Still, I hear it. Faint whispers drifting from within, threaded with the deeper pulse that fills the water. Sometimes, as I pass a window or the slick surface of a wall, I see something impossible, reflections not of Atlantis but of the ship. The mess hall lights flickering in the distance, the corridor where I once tried to barricade my cabin, the glint of wet steel steps. They vanish when I look directly at them, leaving only the soft sway of banners and the shimmer of the current. I began to lose track of my own body. My skin feels lighter, smoother, the scars on my hands fading until I can no longer remember what caused them. My lungs no longer ache, though I breathe water without thought. My voice, when I try to use it, emerges only as a faint vibration, carried more in the bones than the ears. On what might have been the 5th or 50th day, I found one of the crew. The pilot stood in the middle of a narrow street, dressed not in his work clothes but in a flowing garment of white and silver. His head turned toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition. But when he smiled, the expression was too perfect, too symmetrical, the spirals in his eyes glowing faintly in the amber haze. Without speaking, he turned and walked toward the temple. I followed. The gates seemed wider now, the shadows within deeper than before. The figure on the throne did not move, but I felt its awareness sharpen, coiling around me like a current. It was patient as it had always been. The pulse quickened slightly, and I realized it was waiting for something. Not from the city, not from the tide, but from me. And in that moment, I understood the worst truth of all. Atlantis had not chosen me to witness it. It had chosen me to stay. At first, the changes were subtle, so slow they could almost be mistaken for imagination. My hands seemed paler, the veins tracing my wrists shifting in faint spirals before fading again. The weight in my limbs was gone, replaced by a fluid lightness, as though my body had learned the city's rhythm and was moving with it. I no longer felt hunger or thirst. When I tried to remember the sensation, the memory was hollow, like a word I could not quite pronounce. My skin no longer wrinkled in the water, though it had been submerged for days, weeks. Time had thinned here, each moment folding seamlessly into the next. The whispers had grown clearer. They followed me through the streets, drifting from the mouths of the faceless citizens, though none of them looked at me when they spoke. Sometimes I thought they were fragments of memory, other times instructions, but they always led me toward the temple. I tried once to turn away, to lose myself in the farthest edges of the city, but Atlantis has no edges. Streets bent subtly back toward the center. Bridges that should have led outward only wound higher before folding down toward the same black gates. And yet, sometimes a rupture appeared. In the corner of my eye, the city would ripple, and the ship would bleed through. I saw the rusted railing of the Calyptra, the dull gleam of wet steel stairs, the cracked lens of the sonar monitor. Once, I heard the echo of the captain's voice calling from far above the surface, though the words were muffled and wrong. The worst was the mirror pool. It lay in a small courtyard of white stone, the water so perfectly still it might have been glass. When I leaned over it, I expected to see my own reflection, altered though it might be. Instead, I saw my cabin, the bed, the desk, the drawer where I had hidden the seashells fragments. For a moment, I thought I could see my own body lying there, still and unmoving, as though waiting to wake. But the reflection blinked first. The pull of the temple was impossible to resist after that. The gates yawned wider, and inside, the throne's figure had grown clearer, almost solid, its surface still shifting but with a more human outline now. It felt closer, less a distant presence and more something stepping forward, one pace at a time. When I stood at the base of the steps leading to the throne, the pulse matched my heartbeat perfectly. Or perhaps it was the other way around. My body no longer felt entirely mine. My thoughts were moving with the tide. The whispers said one thing, again and again, until I could no longer tell if they were speaking or if I was thinking it myself. You are almost ready. The first time I saw my hands change fully, I did not panic. That frightened me more than the transformation itself. The fingers had grown longer, the skin a pale translucence threaded with faint silver veins, curling in delicate spirals beneath the surface. My nails had thinned into glass-like edges that caught the light of the water and refracted it in subtle patterns on the temple's floor. They did not feel foreign. They felt like they had always been waiting. I moved differently now. My feet no longer touched the ground with weight. Instead, each step was more like a drift, a deliberate glide that matched the currents threading through the city. The air, or whatever passed for air here, slid through me without effort. Even my heartbeat felt distant, as though the pulse of the tide had replaced it entirely. The city was changing too. Walls that once seemed solid now shimmered as though spun from strands of liquid light. Streets curved in ways that no longer followed the architecture I had learned. They bent like rivers, flowing toward the temple whether I wished it or not. But the greater change was in the water itself. Shadows began to appear within it, faint outlines of hallways and bulkheads, of railings slick with rust, of doors swaying open on broken hinges. The Calyptra was bleeding into Atlantis. I would turn a corner and find myself in a narrow steel corridor, the floor tilting slightly under the weight of the sea, light flickering from a ceiling panel that should not be there. I would blink and it would be gone, replaced by pale stone and spiraling bridges. But sometimes, the two remained together, stone archways sprouting from the walls of the mess hall, a crystal spire rising through the center of the engine room. The crew were here too. I saw them moving in both worlds at once, their Atlantean robes swaying in the water even as the shadows of their old uniforms clung faintly to them. Their eyes never left me. The captain appeared without warning at the edge of the temple steps. His face was no longer entirely human. The skin had the same pale translucence as my own, and the spirals in his eyes had deepened, slow and hypnotic. He lifted his hand toward me, not as an order but as an invitation. The throne's figure rose. It did not stand in the way I understood standing. It unfolded, each movement fluid and continuous, its limbs elongating until it towered over me. The shifting of its form slowed now, solidifying into something close enough to human that I could almost believe it was one of us once. The two worlds rippled together. I could see the ship's bridge above the throne's head, the helm glistening wet, the instruments flickering on and off in time with the pulse. Through the shattered windows, I saw the endless city stretching beyond. And in that instant, I understood. The ship had never found Atlantis. Atlantis had found the ship. The throne's figure descended the steps with a movement that was neither walking nor swimming, its form bending and folding with the current, each motion precise, deliberate. As it drew closer, the water thickened, the amber light dimming until only the pale glow of the spirals in its surface remained. It reached me without touching, yet I felt the contact in every nerve. Images burst into my mind, not as visions but as memories. Memories I had never lived. I was standing on dry land beneath a blue sky, the towers of Atlantis unbroken, glittering in the sun. The streets were alive with voices, real voices warm and human. The tide had not yet come. I could feel the hum beneath my feet even then, buried deep in the rock, waiting. The scene shifted. The sea rose, not with violence but inevitability, an endless wall of black water curling overhead. The people did not flee. They knelt, hands to the ground, eyes open, mouths moving in silent prayer. The tide was not an enemy. It was their god. But gods are never satisfied. It whispered to them, not in words, but in promises. It could preserve the city, keep it whole and untouched, free from the slow decay of time. All it asked was surrender. All it demanded was that Atlantis never breathe air again. The memory collapsed. I was back in the temple, the figure standing over me, the tides pulsed deep in my chest. Now I understood. Atlantis was not lost. It was bound, suspended in the tide's endless body, protected from death but never living. Its people stripped of will, their souls folded into the water until they were part of its slow, eternal mind. The tide had grown hungry over the centuries. It reached upward now, beyond the seabed, searching for vessels, for minds, for flesh to braid into its own. The Calyptra was simply the first ship it had managed to take whole in decades. And me, I was not a prisoner. I was an heir. The spirals in my skin burned faintly, and I realized they were no longer marks but channels, delicate veins through which the tides will flowed. My thoughts shifted, bending toward its logic, its patience. It showed me the future, the ship and the city fully merged, the crew moving as one body, their voices silent, their eyes fixed on the deep. Other ships following, drawn by currents they could not resist. One by one, they would join, until the tide had woven a network of bodies and cities in steel, all pulsing to the same eternal rhythm. When the vision ended, the figure stepped back, waiting. It had given me understanding, but not yet taken my choice. Behind me, through a ripple in the water, I saw the cabin again. My bed, the desk, the drawer. The reflection was still. I could feel that if I reached for it now, I might wake. But I did not move. I hovered there in the water, the throne's figure before me, the reflection of my cabin behind. The two worlds pulsed in and out of each other like overlapping waves, neither fully present, neither fully gone. I could still feel the pull of the drawer in my cabin, the cold surface of the seashell fragments I had hidden there. The tether, faint but real. I tried to remember why I had come here. The expedition, the sonar readings, the thrill of discovery. All of it seemed childish now, a language I could no longer speak. The tide's hum filled my head, its patience pressing down on me like the weight of the entire sea. It had given me a choice, or so I believed. Stay or return. I turned toward the reflection. The cabin wavered, as if sensing my decision. I took a step, then another, the throne's gaze burning against my back. The water thickened around my legs, resisting me. My body felt heavier with each movement, the spirals in my skin brightening, threading upward toward my throat. I reached for the surface of the mirror pool. My fingers touched it, and the world fractured. The cabin's walls buckled, the air spilling out in silver streams. The desk warped, drawers splitting open, papers drifting like kelp. The bed frame twisted into a pale arch of Atlantean stone. The tide had never offered escape. It had offered assimilation. I was no longer moving toward the cabin. I was pulling it toward me. The ship's steel twisted and stretched, bending into the city's architecture. Bulkheads became bridges. Hatches became doorways. The helm towered over the temple like a second throne. My own choice had only given the tide permission to take more. The reflection collapsed entirely, and the two worlds locked together. The amber light filled every corridor of the Calyptra. I could see crew members drifting through the ship's flooded halls, their eyes gleaming faintly as they moved with the same slow grace as the citizens of Atlantis. The throne's figure did not move closer. It did not have to. The pulse in my chest was no longer separate from its own. Somewhere deep in the merged halls of ship and city, I felt the tide stretch outward again, searching, waiting for the next vessel. I realized, with a cold certainty, that it would find one. And when it did, I would be the one to greet them. The choice was never mine. It was only my turn. The city was never still, even when its streets seemed empty. When the temple's arches stood silent and unmoving, I could feel the tide running through every stone, a slow heartbeat that pulsed beyond time. That heartbeat was mine now, too. The throne no longer needed to summon me. I felt its presence always, a shadow stitched to my spine. My vision roamed farther than my body could drift. I could see beyond the city's edge, past the submerged cliffs, down into the yawning canyons where the water was black and ancient. Something waited there. That something was my task to watch for. The tide taught me without words. I knew when a current shifted unnaturally, when vibrations trembled through the silt far beyond the city's reach. I could hear the faintest metal groan miles away and taste the trace of oil drifting on the water. These were the signs. These were the first whispers of a vessel approaching. The knowledge came with something else, an awareness of what had come before me. I began to see through the eyes of those who had once stood where I stood now. Their shapes and names dissolved into the tide. One had been a sailor from a wooden frigate, another a merchant in a metal trawler, another, something older still, standing not in a city of stone but of coral and shell. All had been watchers. All had been tasked with listening for the next arrival. And when I closed my eyes, the past pushed harder. I was in ancient Atlantis again, walking along a terrace high above the sea. The water glittered, the towers brilliant in the sun. The high priest stood at the balcony, head bowed, listening to something no one else could hear. "The tide comes," he said, not with his mouth but through the steady pressure in my mind. It was not a warning. It was a prayer. The city's people believed the tide to be a guardian, a protector that would preserve them from the erosion of wind and rain, from the slow crumble of centuries. But I could feel the hunger beneath that promise even then. The tide did not protect. Collected, I returned to the present with the certainty that my vigil would end as theirs had, with the arrival of a vessel, and the folding of more lives into the tide's endless body. And far beyond the cliffs, in the black water, something stirred. It began with a tremor, not in the city, but in the water itself. A faint, rhythmic shudder that threaded through the deep and into the marrow of my bones. It was not the heartbeat of the tide. It was something foreign, mechanical, steady. I followed it outward, my awareness stretching into the open expanse beyond Atlantis's boundary. The water grew colder, darker. Currents twisted in strange directions, ripples folding back against themselves as if unsure whether to advance or retreat. Then I felt it. Pressure waves, precise and repeated. Sonar. The sensation was more than sound. It was a touch, a probing hand sweeping the ocean floor, mapping it without ever seeing it. The tide did not like to be touched. I could feel its displeasure tightening through the stone beneath me, a low groan echoing through the streets. The signal grew sharper. I sensed the vessel's mass. Long, steel-bodied, layered with compartments of air. I could almost hear footsteps on its deck. Faint voices carried through vibrations in the hull. They were searching, They had not yet found us. The tide stirred in response, sending tendrils of current spiraling outward, subtle enough to be mistaken for natural drift. I understood instinctively they were hooks, invisible lures, guiding the vessel toward the city. In the deep past, I saw the same pattern. 1,000 years earlier, when the towers of Atlantis still breathed air, a merchant ship had drifted too close to shore. The high priest stood at the harbor's edge, his hands clasped, as the tide curled up from the shallows like an unseen hand. The ship's sails filled with wind from the wrong direction. His crew believed themselves lucky. They never reached open water again. The memory bled away, leaving only the present, the tremor of sonar growing closer with each sweep. The tides will pressed into me, urging me to reach out, to help draw the vessel in. And yet, somewhere in that signal I felt something that was not the tide. A flicker of human intent, a curiosity sharper than fear. They were coming. The tide's instructions came without words, only impulses, small, sharp urges threading through my thoughts until I could no longer separate them from my own. I drifted upward from the city, toward the pale blur of the surface. My body moved with the grace of the water itself, not swimming so much as being carried. The vessel's pulse was stronger now, each rotation of its sonar a gentle tap at the edge of my senses. I could feel the vibrations of its engines, the churn of propellers, the shudder of its hull against swells. The tide pressed deeper into me, urging me to push the currents, to twist the ocean around them just enough to steer their path. I obeyed. The sea bent at my will, no, at the tide's will through me. A subtle shift in temperature here, a current angled there. I wove them together, a net of invisible force that nudged the ship's bow toward the city. If they checked their instruments, they might see nothing unusual, only a favorable drift, a gentle helping hand. But beneath that guiding touch was something else, a hunger. I felt it in my bones, in the slow turning of the city's great arches, in the way the streets seemed to lean toward the harbor. The hunger was patient but absolute. In the ancient timeline, I saw the same method unfold. A band of dissenters had once tried to flee Atlantis by raft. The tide had not pursued them in violence. Instead, it sent the wind to falter, the stars to shift, the currents to spin in place. Days later, delirious and broken, they washed ashore again, only to be taken into the temple and never seen in daylight. I tore myself from the vision and felt the new vessel's presence drawing closer. The tide thrummed in satisfaction. And then something strange. From the ship came not only the mechanical rhythm of machines but a sharp burst of thought, unfiltered and raw. A mind brushing against mine. A flash of light, the cold sting of metal rail beneath fingers, the smell of salt and oil. It was not an accident. Someone on board was reaching out. For the first time since my assimilation, the tide hesitated. The surface was a trembling veil above me, a silver skin rippling with sunlight. The vessel's shadow cut across it, long and dark, wavering like a predator's fin. I hovered below, my body anchored in the stillness of the deep, watching. It was smaller than the Calyptra, sleeker, built for research, not freight. The white of its hull gleamed against the blue. The name etched along the bow in block letters I could read even from here, Orpheus. The tide coiled in anticipation. It pressed against my mind, feeding me details through vibrations in the water. The slow sweep of its propellers, the faint metallic ring of tools shifting in storage, the shuffle of boots across deck plates. Every heartbeat of the ship was laid bare to me. But that other presence, the one I had felt before, was stronger now. It was focused, deliberate. Thoughts spilled into mine like fragments of a dream. The burn of sun on skin, the weight of binoculars in hand, the flash of movement in the waves. Someone was looking for something. No, someone was looking for me. The tide recoiled at the intrusion, its hunger sharpening into something colder. It sent a surge of current upward, slamming against the hull in a way the crew would think was the swell of an unexpected wave. The vessel rocked, but did not turn away. In the ancient city, the water around the harbor darkened. I was standing, no, he was standing, on the temple steps, watching as a ship of blackwood and gold trim approached. It too carried a searcher, a man who stared unflinchingly at the city through a spyglass. His eyes met mine across centuries. I blinked, and the vision dissolved. The Orpheus was lowering something into the water, ropes, steel, a cage-like frame. I felt the vibration of the winch through the water as it descended. The tides will surged within me, urging me to shatter it, to drag it down into the dark. But the other presence brushed my mind again, whisper light yet insistent. This time, the thought was clear: we know what happened to the Calyptra. I froze. The tide's heartbeat pounded through the city, demanding action. But my own, what was left of it, beat once, quietly, in defiance. The tide did not wait. Its will slammed into me like a storm front, flooding my senses until the world was nothing but its hunger. The Orpheus's frame dangled just meters above the city's boundary now, its descent too slow for the tide's liking. I felt the streets of Atlantis tilt imperceptibly toward the harbor, the weight of its towers drawing water into a slow, spiraling vortex. The currents I had once shaped with subtlety now roared in full force, twisting around the vessel's hull, coaxing it downward. And yet, my focus was not on the tide's prize, but on the mind still pressing against mine. It came in rapid bursts now, like flares in the dark. The smell of paper charts marked with inked circles, the memory of voices debating coordinates in a cramped cabin, the certainty that this place should not exist. Whoever they were, they knew enough to search, but not enough to understand what they had found. Atlantis swelled into the present. The airless streets shimmered under the distorted surface light, and for a heartbeat I saw the Orpheus not above but within them, its steel frame ghosting through marble archways. The timelines were no longer holding their places, they were folding. In the ancient city, panic had taken root. Citizens lined the harbor, pointing to a ship that should have been weeks away. The high priest stood unmoving on the temple steps, chanting in a language older than the sea. Above him, the sky rippled as though it too were made of water. In the present, the Orpheus's winch screamed as its cable snapped taut. The vortex had it now, dragging the vessel's bow into a slow, inevitable lean toward the deep. I could feel the fear of its crew vibrate through the metal, mingling with the tide's glee. The searcher's mind cut through the chaos one last time, clearer than ever. If you can hear me, we can break it. The tide reacted instantly. It poured its presence into me, blotting out everything but its own voiceless demand. Silence them. I hovered between the pull of the tide and the fragile thread of that human voice, knowing the choice I made in the next moment would not just be mine, but would ripple through both worlds. The city's heart pounded once, deep and slow. The Orpheus's hull groaned. The sky above Atlantis buckled inward. Everything was about to become one. The tide was inside me, pressing from every direction, its hunger filling the space where my thoughts should have been. The Orpheus tilted deeper into the spiral, its hull groaning as water surged over the deck. I could see their faces now through the shimmer, pale, frantic, unprepared for what waited below. The searcher's mind clung to mine with desperate force. You are not gone. You can still choose. In the ancient city, the high priest raised both hands. The harbor's water rose in a single smooth wall, shimmering like glass. Behind it, the sky bent and folded, spilling light into the sea. The ship in that world and the Orpheus in mine occupied the same space now. Two vessels separated by centuries, caught in the same closing hand. The tide's command was absolute. My body strained toward the harbor's center, ready to seal the trap, to feed both ships into its endless depth. And yet, I turned, not away from the tide's will, but toward the thread of humanity still tangled in me. I pushed against the spiral not to free myself, but to fracture the perfect symmetry of its pull. The currents shuddered. The vortex broke in uneven waves. The Orpheus slid sideways in the water, scraping against the invisible walls of Atlantis before wrenching free. Its engines roared to life, churning white foam as it tore from the city's boundary. The tide screamed without sound. The vision of ancient Atlantis collapsed in on itself, towers bending and streets folding into the black. I was flung backward into the deep, the city's gates slamming shut with the weight of centuries. When I surfaced, The Orpheus was a shrinking shadow against the horizon. They had escaped, but the tide was still here, and so was I. Bound, waiting, watching. It would not end with this ship. If you have stayed with me this far, keep listening. There are more tides, more cities, more stories hidden under the dark. Follow, like, and subscribe so you will be here when the next vessel comes.